Hi everybody, sorry about the technical hitch there. If you've ever heard me speak before, which you probably haven't, I can speak at 1 of 3 speeds, which is fast, very fast, and on amphetamines. Given I've only got 15 minutes today, I'm going to probably do the amphetamine-fueled version. Just to start off, I do need to explain, I've been working in the area of behavioural addictions now for nearly 30 years. I did my PhD on slot machine addiction way back in the mid-80s. In 1989, I started studying video game addiction. In 1994, I started publishing on internet addiction. In 1997, I started on exercise addiction. 2001, sex addiction. In 2005, work addiction. I've basically covered the whole lot over my years, but most of my papers are on gambling and gaming addictions. And when we put our hands up right at the start, I personally believe, and I'm a gamer myself, is that the advantages of gaming far outweigh the disadvantages. But as Adam just said, is that just because there are many, many advantages, that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at the small proportion of people that might be suffering problems from engaging in particular behaviours, of which video games is one of them. For me, as I say, I've been working in the area of addictive behaviour a long, long time now, and for me there are kind of 3 fundamental questions in the area when we look at any kind of behavioural addiction. First one, well, what is addiction? Every single one of you in this room will have a different idea of what it is to be addicted to something, and my own kind of perception, what I believe about addiction, when I talk about addiction, I talk about gaming addiction. I want it to mean in the same context that we talk about alcohol addiction or heroin addiction. If we're going to use the word addiction, we have to be very clear on what we're actually trying to elucidate and describe here. So when I use the word addiction, I am really trying to say this is something I'm trying to compare right across many different chemical and behavioural addictions. Now, I don't think we're going to come to an agreement today on what addiction is, but that is the fundamental question at the heart of many of the debates. The second thing is, well, does gaming addiction actually exist? And of course, that will depend on your operational definition of what addiction is in the first place. And then the third question for me, which we're probably not going to get into that much today, is what if people are addicted to games, what are they actually addicted to? I think there are lots of different things that are going on with games. And of course, as a professor of gambling studies, which is my main day job, we use the phrase horses for courses, and of course people are individuals, and people, when they're playing a video game, they'll have different appeals, they'll have different attractions, and different things within the game might be something that they're potentially become addicted to. Well, as I say, I've been, in terms of my work, I believe that all addictions involve and comprise 6 different components. For me, as long as any behaviour, I don't care what the behaviour is, as long as the behaviour fulfills these 6 components, then I would operationally define that activity as a genuinely addictive behaviour. So what I've got here is the first component there is something that I call salience. And basically what this means is this is the single most important thing in this person's life. Here is something that a person will do to neglect almost everything else in their life. Okay, what we're talking about here is total preoccupation. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, Mark, I know people that are addicted to nicotine, alcohol, heroin. They don't sit around all day thinking about this activity, and you're right. The reason they don't sit around thinking about it all day because it's at their disposal. It's right next to them most of the time. I mean, I could be an alcoholic, and in this glass here, it could be neat vodka for all you know. Okay, now the point about this, I could be an alcoholic and give this lecture at the same time very, very easily. If I was allowed to smoke, I could smoke and give this talk very, very easily. If I was a gambling addict, I'd find it very hard to play a slot machine in front of you and give this lecture. I'd find it very hard as a sex addict to have sex in front of you now and give this lecture. The point about behavioural addictions is they really do take up not just people's cognitive capacities, but it takes up their behavioural capacity as well. And so in 2005, I introduced a concept in a journal called Reverse Salience. I taught, and this was to apply to particularly chemical-based addictions. So for instance, if you are addicted to nicotine, when you're on a 24-hour plane flight to New Zealand, I can tell you now that nicotine does become the single most important thing in your life because you are prevented from engage in your activity of choice. Now, the thing about behavioural addictions is they do take up a lot of time because people behaviourally doing these things all the time. So that's just the first component. The second component is this idea, for me, that one of the fundamental things about addiction is it actually changes mood state. And I think there's a very paradoxical quality about most addictions, is that addictions not only get you buzzed up, high, aroused, excited, but they can do the exact opposite. They can help you numb, distress, relax, totally escape. And people can get different effects at different times of the day, even with the same activity. For the smokers amongst us, and I'm not one, but if you are, that first cigarette or 2 in the morning gives you that nicotine rush to get going for the day. But by the end of the day, you're not using it for the nicotine rush, you're using it to kind of de-stress, relax, and escape, and just kind of zone out and numb out from the day-to-day what you're doing. The third thing, and people have criticised me saying we shouldn't be using words like tolerance for behavioural addictions. Well, I can tell you now, for me, tolerance is this idea of needing more and more of this activity to get those same initial mood-modifying effects. So for the heroin addict who used to take a small amount of heroin, 6 months later they may be taking 4 times as much just to get those same effects that they used to get when they took a much smaller amount 6 months ago. Well, this happens with video games. This happens with gambling. Is what we see is people building up the amount of time that they play, playing bigger and bigger games. In my main field of gambling, what we see is people gambling with bigger and bigger bet sizes to get those same initial mood-modifying effects. And the fourth component there, withdrawal. To me, this is fundamental to addiction. I don't think we can call behaviours addictions unless there is an identifiable withdrawal syndrome. I can tell you now from my work on gambling and some of my work on video game players that, if you like, the most extreme, most intense kind of gamblers and gamers, when you stop them engaging in their behaviour of choice, on a psychological level, when they're prevented from playing, they do increase they do increase levels of frustration, annoyance, anger, irritability, moodiness, but also on a physiological level. You'll see they have hand sweats, nausea, stomach cramps, anxiety attacks, all the things that we would find in other more traditional addictions. Now, I'm not saying this is commonplace, but for me, I do think that is there. But for me, the single most important thing when we talk about addictions is that fifth component there. It's what we call conflict. We're talking about an activity that is so conflicting, it basically compromises your day-to-day relationships. It compromises your work, your schoolwork, your university work, your college work, depending on what age you are. There's also what I would say, you have intrapsychic conflict within yourself. You know that you should be trying to cut down this behavior, but you feel unable to do so. You feel, you experience a subjective loss of control. Now, I've got into big trouble before talking about conflict, because I gave an interview to the Neuroscience magazine, which is Britain's best-selling science weekly magazine. And I was talking about one of my colleagues' stories on gambling addiction. I was asked by the journalist, do I think gambling, when taken to excess, can be a real addiction, even though it doesn't involve the ingestion of a psychoactive substance? I said, yes, of course it can. I went through these 6 components, and I said, I don't care what the behavior is. It can be gambling, it can be heroin people taking heroin, it can be gardening, it can be video game playing, it can be anything you like. The next day in all the papers it says, Professor says gardening is addictive. That's not the point. The point was, I was saying, if I can find a gardener where gardening is the single most important thing in their life, they do it to the neglect of everything else, they get mood-modifying consequences, they get withdrawal effects if they don't engage in it, they built up tolerance over time, it conflicts with everything else in life, and they suffer relapse, to me, there would be a gardening addict. Now, I've never met a gardening addict, but the point is what I'm saying is theoretically, it's quite, could actually exist. And then finally, we've got relapse. Again, going back to smoking, smoking is the classic relapse behavior. There's a lovely quote from the American author Mark Twain who said, giving up smoking is really easy to do. I've done it thousands of times. And to me, that is the classic thing. So for me, that's where I conceptualize addiction. Now, in 1995, I wrote a paper simply called Technological Addictions. This was the first time that anyone had used it. I coined that particular term, and now it's lovely to see hundreds of researchers all over the world looking at things like social networking addiction, television addictions, video game addictions, slot machine addictions, all under this banner of technological addictions. And for me, I operationally define those behaviours as excessive person-machine interaction that feature all the core components, those 6 components of addiction that I've just gone through. Now, there's been obviously lots of debates about whether gaming addiction actually exists. Now, obviously, because I've been studying it for nearly 3 decades, I passionately do believe that gaming addiction exists. However, in terms of the research that's been done on it, and I've certainly published well over 100 academic, refereed, scientific papers just on video game addiction, I believe that the true proportion of genuine addicts is very, very small based on my criteria. But of course, the American Psychiatric Association wanted this issue looked at. They wanted it looked at more in the context of internet addiction disorder. There have been lots of debates about whether it should actually come into the DSM-5. And what's happened now is that internet gaming disorder is now in section 3 of the current DSM-5. This has been seen as something that is an emerging issue that we should be doing more research on. According to Nancy Petrie, who sat on that committee, and Charles O'Brien, they said that internet gaming disorder will not be included as a separate mental disorder unless a number of things happen. That the defining features of IGD have to be identified, that the reliability and validity of all the screens that we're using have to be obtained cross-culturally, that prevalence rates that we get from our research have to be determined in representative epidemiological samples. And I just would say, of over the 100 studies that have been published on video game addiction, only 2 of them have used nationally representative samples, one in Singapore and one in Germany. So most of the studies use self-selected samples. And finally, we have to look at the etiology of associated biological features and how they have to be evaluated. So anyway, I personally do think that it will be included in the next either revision or the DSM-6. But from my perspective, what is it about the internet that makes the internet so seductive, so attractive? I think there are lots of different things, and this applies to my work on online gambling, online sex, online video game playing, because most addictions, there's a real big difference between addictions on the internet and addictions to the internet. I've got into big debates and battles in the scientific literature with a woman called Kimberly Young here in the United States. Kimberly Young basically says that things like internet gaming disorder is basically a subtype of internet addiction. I personally believe that online gaming addiction is a subtype of video game addiction. Video game addiction is something, a separate entity. But basically what we've got at the moment is that we've got high accessibility to the internet, high affordability, and I just remember back in 1994 when I started on internet addiction, I used to get letters, not in emails in those days because the internet wasn't very popular then, but back in 1994 I would get letters from parents saying, my son is addicted to the internet, and I would say, why do you think that? And they would say, because my phone bills every month are, £1,000, and basically they were paying by the minute on their modem. And of course, when there's a financial consequence to your addiction, it tends to be a lot more pathologized and problematized. That's one of the reasons why gambling addiction is probably the most severe of all behavioral addictions, because if you spend 12 hours gambling, you lose a lot of money. If you spend 12 hours gaming, you don't lose the money. What you do is lose a lot of time, which will also have implications for life. We also know that the internet, in terms of anonymity, it's a really big psychological component. I know when I'm gambling online, that's totally different from gambling offline. I don't feel any embarrassment or guilt when I lose online because people can't see me when I'm losing, but offline it's very different. We've got convenience, disinhibition, escape, and basically the social acceptability. I remember writing a paper back in the 1990s about people who met on the net and then got married. Then it was just seen as bizarre. Now it's, of course, the internet is another tool in our social armory in our day-to-day lives. For me, just quickly on online gaming addiction, I've said to you already, there have been now over 100 empirical studies that have been published on online gaming addiction. Nearly all of those argue that the addiction is on a continuum, from obviously non-playing at one end to very pathological playing at the other end. There are antecedents, very common antecedents and consequences that we've seen in the literature, and that gaming addiction is so associated, like with other addictions, with particular personality traits from a psychological perspective, things like introversion, sensation-seeking, neuroticism, high state trait, anxiety, etc. Also, the real problem we've got in the field is that for every paper you read, they've got a slightly different definition or concept of what they're talking about. They talk about things like problematic video game playing, problematic online game use, video game addiction, online gaming addiction. Are these all the same? And it all depends on which particular screening they've used. Now, this last point, I'd really want to take this with a kind of pinch of salt, because based on those 100+ empirical studies so far, is that what you tend to read is that excessive or problematic engagement is found, according to those studies, in 8 to 12% of individuals that they've surveyed. And remember, a lot of these are amongst gaming communities themselves, not on a nationally represented population. And that it also occurs in 2 to 5% of children, teenagers, and students. Now, for me, I've been accused saying I shouldn't say this, but this is what I believe. If video game addiction really was at that particular level, let's just say that it was a 5% level, I would expect there to be a video game addiction treatment clinic in every major city in the States, everywhere in the UK. We're starting to get that with things like gambling, but we're not seeing it with gaming. Maybe it hasn't reached that tip of the iceberg yet, but I personally believe that most of the scales and screens that we use basically overestimate the prevalence of true video game addiction. I said there's 6 components. On some of those scales, you just have to endorse 3 things to be classed as a problematic video game player. And that's problematic playing is very different for me from addictive playing. Okay, I said about gaming addiction screens. We published a survey in 2000, we published a comprehensive review in 2013. And at that particular time, there were 18 different screens being used to assess video game addiction right across the world. There's now at least 23. I know at least 5 more scales have been developed since then, including another 2 that I've co-developed using IGD criteria from the new DSM-5. In those studies, at that point, there were 63 studies that comprised over just under 60,000 individuals. And we looked at those instruments, and we found there were some real benefits from those instruments. Most of them were quite short. They had brevity and ease of scoring. Most of them had excellent psychometric properties in terms of validity and reliability and internal consistency. And we said that robust data will actually aid the field in the development of a new standardized test. However, there were lots and lots of weaknesses identified. Okay, the core addictive indicators were inconsistent across the studies. There was inconsistent cutoff scores in what counted as problem or non-problematic gaming. There was poor and inadequate inter-rater reliability, and there was untested and inconsistent dimensionality. Now, what I would say from that, additionally to that, most of these were self-selected samples as well, not nationally representative. So for me, what you read in the press when it says, new study says 1 in 10 kids addicted to video games, remember it will be 1 in 10 addicted based on the criteria used by the researchers in that particular study. By using my criteria, my guess is you get 0.00 whatever percent, because very few children, adolescents, or even adults endorse 6 or more of the criteria on those particular scales. So now, just to end on, we now have got internet gaming disorder in the DSM-5. Okay, I've got 2 minutes left. So I just want to show you the 6 components that I use for operationalizing addiction do actually map onto these new 9 criteria. So we've got the 9 criteria are preoccupation with internet games, so that's salience, withdrawal symptoms when internet game is taken away, withdrawal, the need to spend increasing amounts of time engaged in internet gaming, tolerance, unsuccessful attempt to control participation in internet gambling, relapse, loss of control, loss of interest in other hobbies, conflict, continued excessive use despite psychosocial problems, again conflict, deception to family members, etc., again conflict, use of the internet gaming to escape or relieve a negative mood, mood modification, and a final another conflict where it's impeding in a significant thing in your life, either relationship, job, etc. So the things that I've been using for many, many years on lots of the are actually being fundamentally used in the new criteria in the DSM-5. So my conclusions today, I personally think that online addictions appear to exist, although it depends on, this is a really crucial question, it depends on what the addiction criteria are and what your operational definition of addiction is in the first place. Despite them, and I have to say, I'm glad that the first speaker talked about, quoted from my positive aspects. I've written loads on the positive aspects of the game, and I personally believe there are lots and lots of positives, and they significantly outweigh the negatives. But that doesn't mean that it isn't negative to a small minority of individuals. In this particular case, the medium may be more harmful for particular susceptibilities we were talking about. Well, is it more dangerous for somebody with an attention deficit disorder to play? And I think that's what we should look at, different target and risk groups that might have different problems. And finally, most research suggests that online addictions are very specific. You know, now, I mean, about 3 or 4 years ago, I said that, in fact, nearly all addictions were really not internet addictions. They were basically addictions on the internet rather than to the internet. But however, we've now got social networking addiction. You know, the thing is, if I'm a gambling addict, and I know I've got to stop, just want to say one more thing. If I'm a gambling addict and the internet goes down, what do? I go to a casino or a betting shop to engage in my habit. If I'm a gamer and I can't game online, I will play a console. If I'm a social networking addict, I don't come into a room like this and start talking to everybody. This is an activity that only occurs online, and to me that's a genuine internet addiction, okay, because it's an activity that will only occur online. Thank you very much.